So the third panel, as you can see from the agenda, is titled Regulatory Budgets, First in Administration, Next in Congress. It was interesting in preparing for this panel. I started by looking back to a 1980 article published in AEI's Regulation magazine titled The Regulatory Budget. It seemed like a good place to start. And it was authored by one of our panelists, Chris Demuth. I hope you remember. But since then, there's been an interesting debate just in recent years over regulatory budgets. There was an article in National Affairs, Yuval Levin's magazine, by Jeff Rosen, now the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, called Putting Regulators on a Budget. All this seemed sort of a rather academic debate until late January of last year, when President Trump, somewhat surprisingly, signed Executive Order 13771, titled Reducing Regulation and Controlling Regulatory Costs, which, among other things, put agencies on a budget, so to speak, capping their cumulative regulatory costs. Seeing it happen in the executive branch, when we're looking very forward to hearing sort of how it's proceeding from Jeff, we thought it'd be interesting to have a discussion, not just of what's happened so far in the executive branch, but also expanding that discussion to one of whether this would be worthwhile for Congress to consider integrating into its own legislative activities. And so I'm pleased to introduce our three speakers, all of whom have real expertise and experience on the subject. We'll first hear from Jeff Harris. Jeff is the Associate Administrator for the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, working with Naomi Rao in the White House, reviewing significant regulations. Before joining government, Jeff was a partner at Kirkland & Ellis and at Bancroft LLP, the Supreme Court boutique, focusing on Supreme Court litigation. Before that, he clerked for Chief Justice Roberts, Judge Silberman, and Judge David B. Santel. Our second speaker, sitting to my left, is Chris Demuth. Chris is a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he researches and writes on Congress regulation and the administrative state. Before joining Hudson, he was the president of the American Enterprise Institute from 1986 to 2008. And it was his work at AEI that really established that institute as the nation's, or as Washington's leading, I should not compare you to Hoover. Hoover's based in California, but AEI was Washington's premier institute for regulatory analysis and for thoughtful analysis of the administrative state. And before joining AEI, Chris was at OIRA. He was its second administrator from 1981 to 1983. Then our third speaker is Dr. Patrick McLaughlin. He directs the Program for Economic Research on Regulation, and he's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Institute at George Mason University. Among the many things he's done at Mercatus is establishing and leading the Reg Data and QuantGov projects, which he'll be discussing today. Truly innovative tools for analyzing the costs and impacts of regulation. So without any further ado, let's begin with Jeff with a basic description of how things have played out in OIRA.
Great. So thank you, Adam and CSAS, for having me. I have great respect for the organization and what you're doing, and look forward to a good discussion. So I'll be talking about recent reg budgeting efforts in OIRA, and so just wanted to talk a little bit about who we are, what our priorities are, and what we've been doing so far over the last year and a half. So starting as always with the Constitution, Article 2 vests all executive power in the President, and so the President is not only the Commander-in-Chief, but also the Administrator-in-Chief, which is something many scholars of both parties have recognized. And so OIRA plays a very critical role in ensuring presidential direction and supervision of the administrative state, because we're really the interface between the president and the executive office of the presidency and the administrative agencies. So we're a 50-person agency within the Office of Management and Budget, and our core mission is to implement regulatory policy across the government. So most people know us as, we are the entity that reviews all significant regulatory actions before they may be issued. So we have 90 days to do a robust review process. We do our own review process. We do an EOP review process with Council and Domestic Policy Council and National Economic Council and every other White House stakeholder. And we also do a robust interagency process. And so not only do we collect and bring in the comments, but we can help adjudicate them, we can offer our own views, we can elevate things when necessary. So we're sort of running the review process on all significant regs within the White House. But we also, one thing that can get overlooked sometimes is we also deal with bigger picture regulatory policy across the government. So, of course, we'll be talking more about the regulatory budgets, but we also look at the Congressional Review Act, we look at the Paperwork Reduction Act, we look at information collection requests, as well as memos, circulars, and other tools that we can use to move some of the levers of regulatory policy. So a couple notes about what we believe and what Administrator Rao's priorities have been since she's been in office. I think she comes from a background, as you all know, as a constitutional scholar, and so I think this OIRA is deeply committed to ensuring that agencies operate only within their constitutional and statutory limits. I think Director Mulvaney put it very well in his capacity as CFPB director when he said, our job is not to push the envelope. Statutes in the Constitution exist for a reason, and they exist to constrain the administrative state. And so I think we believe very strongly that it is not the job of a regulator to be pushing the envelope, but instead to be faithfully following and executing the law. So that's sort of our first principle. Second, we're of course committed to rigorous cost-benefit analysis and a close review of the evidentiary basis for all rules. So we always look at, is there a market failure? Is this something, is there a compelling public need? Is the agency required to do this by statute? And even in a mostly conservative administration, there's often, you see things where there's just a sense of, why are we doing this? And so I think OIRA's well positioned to make sure that new regs are only happening when they are truly necessary and not just a discretionary act by an agency. So we also, building off the first point about sort of the constitutional aspects of what we do, OIRA is working closely with other parts of the White House, especially the counsel's office, to promote fair notice and due process of regulatory rulemaking. And in particular, this means we're focusing very heavily on guidance documents. We have discussions with agencies many times a week in which we really try to police the lines of what has to be done through notice and comment rulemaking and what can be done through sub-regulatory things. And I think there's pretty broad, even bipartisan consensus that the guidance process had been really taken too far in many ways in the last administration. And I think we're working hard to crack down on that. And then finally, before we get to reg budgeting, we're committed to transparency and openness in the regulatory process. So I think one big change in this administration is that we are really taking seriously the unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions, and we're really using that as a pretty major policy-making tool. So in the past, I think the agenda was often just on autopilot, and agencies would have all different procedures of who could open new matters, who could sort of initiate new items on the agenda, and we take very seriously the idea that if the agency doesn't plan to do something in short order in the time frame of the agenda, the item should not be on there. So I think we're really forcing them to make sure that what they're putting out reflects the current leadership's priorities and isn't just, larded up with these actions that just go on there and stay on there in perpetuity. And then we're also making the agenda itself more transparent. So in the past, there was this secret hidden list of certain inactive regulations, and we've killed that off. We're now requiring all agencies to be transparent, even about their longer term actions, and to make sure that those are publicly available. So now getting to the actual topic of the panel, the regulatory budget. So this administration has set ambitious goals early on about how to shrink regulatory burdens. As Adam said, shortly after taking office, the president signed EO 13771, which had two major components. It is mostly known as the 1 in 2 out EO, which directs agencies to eliminate 2 existing regulations for every new regulation. But the piece that often gets missed or gets less attention is the other clause, which says that each agency must keep regulatory costs to 0 in 2017, and then gave OIRA the authority to address 2018, which I'll address in a minute. So I think the two provisions really work together, and I think each serves an independent but critical purpose. So I think the two in or one in, two out provision is really critical for what I'd call sort of cleanup. So if something is outdated, if it's been overtaken by events, if it's a section of the CFR that just isn't necessary anymore, or an old information collection request or a guidance document, that really incentivizes agencies to sort of pull down these things which are cluttering up the sort of the administrative space but aren't doing much or serving much purpose. But then that's bookended by the regulatory budget, which focuses on the bigger picture things, because of course, to offset the costs of existing regulations, you really have to be digging deep and thinking bigger picture about how you're going to be offsetting any larger regulatory issues. So I think the two really work together to focus on both bigger picture structural things as well as the sort of decluttering or cleanup. So initially, I think some observers viewed these as just gimmicks or viewed them with skepticism. But I think over a year into the administration, the policies are actually working. And so for fiscal year 2017, which just concluded, across the administration, it was 22 deregulatory actions for every one new regulatory action. And then I have the number here. I have it somewhere. In government-wide, it was negative $570 million of annualized cost savings and negative $8 billion in present value. And these are actual tangible cost savings. It's not just the old Washington trick of slowing the rate of growth and then calling that a decline. So I think it's the first time ever that we've actually seen a net negative movement in regulatory costs across the government. And of course, and just by way of comparison, the previous administration had single years in which they imposed, even under their own calculations, more than $20 billion of regulatory costs on the economy. So, it's actually not just putting it in reverse, but actually making meaningful changes. And in addition to that, I mentioned the unified agenda. The agencies have pulled more than 860 planned regulations off of this long-term list, and so making clear that those are not happening and sending a signal to the private sector that they don't need to worry about these things all of a sudden, coming back to life and reappearing. So, and then of course, as you all know, through the Congressional Review Act, Congress and the President have eliminated 15 major regulations that have attracted a lot of attention. Now, for 2018, we followed a little bit of a different process. So the way we ended up handling everything was each agency, it was a sort of an iterative process where each agency, based on their own view of the existing regs, of the capabilities, of their priorities for the next year, each agency offered a proposed regulatory cost allowance, which Administrator Rao said she expected to be negative, and then we had sort of an iterative process with OIRA and the agencies where we ultimately arrived at numbers which were assigned to each agency. So it's been publicly released, and every agency has a different cost allowance for 2018, which we think reflects each agency's different capabilities, because of course all of them have different again, different priorities, different targets, different things they want to pursue. And so I think this is a well-tailored approach that ensures that each agency is being pushed, but also in a realistic way. And I think we're on pace for 2018, based on the current agendas, to have at least 3 deregulatory items for every regulatory item, and to also have, I think it's projected to reach negative $15 billion in terms of the net overall costs. So I'll wrap up there. I think we're excited about the progress so far. I think one of the most important things of the EO is I think it kind of changes the conversation, because the agencies, although of course the agencies need to still regulate in accordance with law and in accordance with the governing statutes, I think it does change the conversation of every time they're regulating, they need to also be thinking about how they're going to be lifting costs at the same time. And so I think just putting that focus on the cost savings and on the deregulatory actions, I think, is new, and I think it just is hopefully a fundamental shift in the way they're looking at regulatory burdens. And so we're very happy with the results of 2017, are encouraged by the early reports on 2018, and look forward to a broader discussion about possible ways to lock this in or make sure that it sticks beyond just this administration.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Chris, you wrote the seminal article on regulatory budget. What's your view now?
Well, since then, 1980, there have been several proposals worked out in some detail for comprehensive budgeting of regulatory compliance costs that involve congressional procedures, executive branch procedures, submissions back and forth by analogy to expenditure budgeting. In fact, the first one was pretty much coterminous with my article, a bill proposed by Senator Lloyd Benson in 1979. More recently, Senator Rubio had such a proposal, a bill that he introduced in 2014. And more recently, the most complete and thoroughly thought through set of proposals comes from Patrick McLaughlin in a paper that he has published recently. For such a regulatory budgeting drill process to be introduced, there is no prospect whatsoever that this could be done in today's Congress, for the simple reason that there's no interest or inclination in Congress today to even budget direct expenditure. So the idea that they'd go on and budget something else seems like a non-starter. Congress has not passed a regular budget and appropriations under the 1974 Budget Act for well over a decade. Large numbers of people in Congress don't even have no recollection of anything like that, and 12 appropriations bills and so forth, and have no interest in being any part of such a controversial and laborious process. When government expenditures get to be several $1 trillion every year, the process of budgeting becomes extremely abstract, big numbers that nobody knows how to comprehend, highly procedural and highly staff dependent, as budgeting would be today. A procedure that budgeted estimated private sector costs would be even more abstract and procedural and staff dependent, simply out of the question. I want to put the matter in more general terms. A regulatory budget, like cost-benefit analysis, like an expenditure budget, is a mechanism of constraint in government operations. There is no effective constituency for constraint of any sort in today's Congress. There are a few members, especially I think among Republicans, although there are a few Democrats too, who understand that organizations need to operate within constraints. And of course, there are endless complaints about this or that individual regulation for being inadequate or excessive or whatever. But no substantial minority, much less a majority of either party, is in favor of imposing systematic constraints as a regular part of government administration, involving large number of votes that involve trade-offs, that are invariably unpopular, take explaining, and so forth. There are also no strong impulses for constraint in the executive or judicial branches of the government today, but there are at least some. There's some energy on behalf of the idea of that government operates within constraints that have an institutional basis and that are consistent with the career incentives of present members of those branches. In the executive branch, it comes simply from management. Anybody who has ever managed an organization or even a family unit understands that there have to be certain constraints and procedures, and we do some things and we do some other things, we don't do other things. You get to know that within the government. The White House especially is very conscious of the need to set priorities amongst the thousands and thousands of things that are going on in the executive branch that people there are responsible for. If you go out to the agencies and the policy offices and the economics staffs, you can see some impulses for constraint. Cost-benefit analysis has been used by the White House for about closing in on 40 years now. Very little help from Congress, although Congress could have helped, but we have seen this happen. Judges are a constraining influence on the discretion of the executive branch in reviewing cases challenging individual rules. It's gotten pretty slack, but I think there's a pretty strong movement back towards a greater degree of oversight from the judges as well. But even if Congress were inclined to develop some sort of serious regulatory budgeting procedure, right now would be a very bad time to do it and a good time to hold off. And that is because of this rather surprising development of the introduction of a form of regulatory budgeting that Mr. Harris was talking about a few minutes ago. The Trump regulatory budget is an important innovation. It is a combination of some of the original regulatory budgeting ideas, such as I wrote about many long years ago, with an idea that had developed more recently that the regulatory budget would simply be applied to incremental regulatory actions in a given year necessary to overcome the gargantuan problems of measuring the costs of the large stocks and flows of government regulations. We'll just look at the annual flow. And then third, and I think most important, this idea that we would combine a regulatory budget with some sort of a pay-go idea, so you have to drop one rule in order to implement a new rule, or in some jurisdictions, the Trump rule is 2 for 1. I think we have some foreign jurisdictions that are getting really aggressive and moving to 3 for 1. It has been the combination of these that has opened up the possibility for actually trying this out. It's in beta version. It's just starting. It's less than a year old. But the genius is that we're not simply dealing with rival estimates of what the private sector costs are. We're combining that with an unambiguous metric, which is number of rules. Number of rules would also be highly problematic. You repeal 2 itsy-bitsy little rules, and then you get to issue some $100 billion rule. In this case, we're going to start with the metric of numbers of rules, and then we're going to use cost estimates to keep the trade-offs commensurate. So if you're eliminating 2 and putting in 1, then you have some kind of a budget, and President Trump's budget for the first year was 0, and for the second year, as run by OIRA, it is a net reduction in incremental costs. When you combine these 3, you have something that you can think of it as moving toward an analogy with the sort of a partial analogy to annual appropriating, such as Congress had been doing until relatively recently in expenditure budgets and might get back to at some point. But it's more in its current practice. It's more a matter of management than appropriating. I think that it could evolve, but it is too soon for Congress to get into the act. If imagine the administration said, well, here's our regulatory budget for this year. First of all, we're going to eliminate 2 regulations for every new regulation we put into place. And secondly, we're going to have a net reduction in the net incremental costs of all of our regulatory actions. What's Congress going to do with that? I mean, and the debates would be incredibly chaotic. Among academics, the debate is still, but you should be taking account of benefits. If there's something that's beneficial, it's good and we want to do it. Why constrain doing beneficial things? But it's very hard for that argument to get anywhere except for a lot of people being angry with each other, into the abstract. What we need is practice. We need to be looking at a series of cases to see how great the good stories or how bad the horror stories are in actual practice. Particularly at this point, it's important to let the administrative process work its way through and find out how useful this initial foray into regulatory budgeting is. The first year, as I'm sure Mr. Harris would acknowledge, has been really, really easy for the Trump administration. Here we have the most aggressively deregulatory administration in history, following the most aggressively pro-regulation administration in history. So there's just an enormous amount of low-hanging fruit of regulations that were put in place relatively recently by the prior management that the new team wants to get rid of. Now, some of them are big and controversial and famous and expensive, like the Clean Power Plan, and so forth. But the town is littered with lots of things. I'll bet nobody's ever heard of electronic pneumatic brakes for trains that are carrying flammable liquids, okay? We've got this rule. It was put into place in 2015 after a couple of spectacular railroad accidents. It was very controversial at the time, but it is in place. And you can, maybe the railroad administration simply had to do something after a couple of big accidents to show that they were on the case. But the people at the Transportation Department, they can't figure out what the previous people were thinking of. And the National Academy of Sciences has looked at this, and this costs billions of dollars with very few benefits that anybody can conceive of. So the new people come in and say, this is just a terrible idea. So they're proposing to get rid of it. So that's going to be savings of a couple $2 billion. And that's one of hundreds of things that nobody in this room has ever heard about. So you're going to be generating a lot of savings because of this very, very great difference in the philosophy of the two administrations. That's not going to go on forever. If President Trump is president for 8 years, into a couple of years, the inherited Obama rules are going to be mostly gone, or we tried to get rid of them, the courts wouldn't let us, or it turned out they were better than we thought. That's going to be over, and there's going to be a phase 2. And the phase 2 is going to be, I think, pretty interesting because it's going to require a real buy-in from the career staff. Every agency has an embedded base of regulations that includes some real dogs. And you don't find out about it by asking the lobbyists or the Sierra Club or anything like that. The only people that know about it are the career professionals in the offices that have been working with these regulations. They know what's worked, they know what hasn't worked. If you say, look, we've got to get rid of a bunch of regulations, they could say, oh man, can I tell you the bad ones? And that will be the next phase after the Obama inheritance. And then things are going to really get interesting because at that point, if we take the regulatory budget seriously, we've got some not bad, somewhat effective regulations are in place. They're controversial, very costly, we're not sure. But we think that they're much less good than some new idea we've got in mind. So we're going to get rid of a not terrible regulation, to do something better, that's going to be when we find out whether we've got a real, live, durable mechanism, and when we're making real cuts. And that will be time, not before then, for Congress to get involved. I'm going to wind up here with a minute. I'm going to race through two final points. There are many other things to be done before you could really conceive of a larger and more ambitious budgeting proposal that Congress could be involved in. There are lots and lots of accounting matters to be worked out on a case-by-case basis with OIRA and in the agencies. I don't know if they've done this, but I think NHTSA is going to permit a much wider array of car batteries. There's been a lot of change in the technology of car batteries, and that big old heavy thing that's sitting in your car, it's pretty much obsolete. The manufacturers want to try some new things, but when you get into lithium-ion batteries, there are actually safety issues that don't exist with the old ones. So we're going to let the automobile manufacturers do a lot of things that they couldn't do before, but the new things are going to be regulated in the way that the old-fashioned batteries weren't. Is this deregulatory or is it regulatory? Are there going to be more mandates or less mandates? Are there more regulatory costs? There are lots and lots of issues like that, and you couldn't sit down and write a regulatory budget statute right now before we have a lot more practice. Eventually, what we're trying to do with the regulatory budget is to change the culture, to get people that are involved in regulation to think in terms of priorities. There are an infinite number of things you can do to make the air or the water cleaner or automobiles safer, but let's focus on doing the things that are most effective. You can find some of that, but the idea is to make it much more embedded. In the early days of the cost-benefit test in the Reagan administration, it was hugely controversial, even more so than the budgeting is today. There were many, many senior established tenured law professors that said that what Reagan was doing was unconstitutional, maybe even impeachable. The statute says the administrator shall issue a rule. It doesn't say the president shall issue. What's the White House doing getting involved in environmental policy? I was very conscious that what we were doing was building precedent. That we were creating a new institution on a sort of a common law basis, and that over time, I wanted to do what Ronald Reagan wanted to do, but I also wanted to build up an institution that would last. Now, we had the people that were clearly for this had 8 years, but when Bill Clinton came in, there was a huge division in his first White House during the transition and in the earlier White House, and there were a lot of people that said, what we came to town to do was to put a wooden stake through the heart of this terrible program. Different people said, well, wait a minute, the regulatory apparatus is pretty big. We've got some of our own ideas what we would like the agencies to do here at the White House, very different than what those bad guys Reagan and Bush wanted to do, but we still want to have some control. And they won the debate, and they kept essentially the same program as had existed in the previous administration. After the Clinton administration, his White House counsel, Elena Kagan, now Justice Kagan, wrote her tenure piece on how Clinton had been more involved in regulatory policy than Reagan had, and all of the articles saying that it was unconstitutional stopped. And it's become part of accepted practice. Something like this could happen, and maybe it will, depending on how the people in the administration do it. Building up congressional capacity. I like the idea of a congressional regulatory office. I really like the idea of retrospective analysis that Phil Wallach emphasized. The lobbyists for regulated firms, the lobbyists for the Sierra Club. They've got their own ideas of what costs are. They often have better information. But if you're working at OIRA, you see how useful it is to have an body of independent analysts to sort out the bunk from the reality and come up with much better assessments. Congress should be able to do that. If it can do it itself, it is oversight. This is serious oversight. And if the members don't want to do oversight, then they've got to set up new offices to do oversight. And this would be a very, very good one. Most of the ideas for getting Congress back into the act in regulatory policy are reactive ideas. That is reacting to the executive branch. REINS is a reactive program. It reacts to initiative from the executive branch. That seems to be sort of part of the political world that we are in right now. So I would urge people in Congress that are interested in these matters, keep paying attention to the intellectual work that people like Patrick are doing. But I think that if this is going to be effective, it has to be something where Congress is eventually reacting to an institution that has been built downtown. Thank you.
You know, thank you very much, Chris. On that point, I do want to add, folks are often familiar with Elena Kagan's article, Presidential Administration, but there's one other article I want to highly recommend. It's new. It's in a recent issue of National Affairs. I swear they didn't buy promotional time at this event, but I keep returning to their articles. It's an article by a political scientist at Bowdoin College named Andrew Rudelovich, and he traced the history of OIRA's work. He traced its roots back not just to Carter, but to the Nixon administration and quality of life review. That's right.
I was there too.
You were there, you and
Yeah.
Jim. And it's a great, quick review of how the 81 executive order built upon something that had grown up over time. And then the point you got at was that it then succeeded because the administration actually invested resources, political capital and other capital, in making a success over time. So I highly recommend it. A longer version of the piece is going to be published soon, and I think the Journal of Political History. But without any further ado, Patrick.
Thank you, Adam. Some of my points are similar to some things that Chris said, and starting with perhaps the understatement of the day. The regulatory apparatus is pretty big, was one thing that Chris said. I'll put some numbers to that. We have a lot of regulations on the books. Back in 1970, there were less than 400,000 regulatory restrictions on the books. Regulatory restrictions, by the way, is a metric we've been developing at Mercatus for years. It's basically, if you count up the shalls and the musts, the words that create prohibitions or obligations in regulatory text, add them all up. If you did that in 1970, there's less than 400,000 of them. If you do that today, in fact, as of this morning, if you went and counted up the restrictions in the electronic version of the Code of Federal Regulations, you'd find 1,087,456, just to put a point of absurdity on this. I'm going down to the last digit. Over 104 million words in the CFR as of this morning, and if you were to read that as your full-time job at 250 words per minute, it would take you 3 years, 116 days, 5 hours, and 6 minutes to get through it all. So yes, the regulatory apparatus is pretty big, and much of that is not just what we're doing, not just the flow, the changes to regulations that are on the books or the people who are employed to do this stuff. A lot of it is what we've built up over the decades, the accumulation of regulations that now sometimes interact, sometimes interfere with each other, sometimes have unintended consequences. So that's my first point, is just that this hidden growth of regulation, hidden perhaps not to people in this room, but hidden by and large to actors in the economy, is measurable. It's continued at a very similar pace for many decades, although 2017, the growth of regulations did slow dramatically from the trend we'd seen in past years, perhaps I'm sure attributable to the efforts of the Trump administration. And maybe that in and of itself, the growth of regulation, isn't necessarily a problem. You could argue, in fact, that that's simply evidence that these regulatory agencies that Congress has been creating for many decades are simply doing their jobs and writing rules. But recent research, some of which is mine, does in fact shine a light on a potential problem here, and it's, I think, relevant to bring up another point that Chris made here. When regulators make rules, they are trying to fix some problem ostensibly, and there always are going to be some resources that go into that, some costs that go into the efforts that the regulators are trying to induce the private sector to undertake. When a household takes actions, or when a business takes actions, but let's just focus on the household, there's a constraint, right? There is a budget necessarily for a household, how much resources, how much money they can devote to any set of actions, and they can't go beyond some limit. They can borrow for a little while, but ultimately there's a constraint for a household that doesn't exist for regulators. When regulators make new regulations, who has to pay the bills? It's the private sector, not the regulators. That means that they can continue regulating, and of course their goal is to fix problems. They're not so worried about whether or not this is causing some long-term hidden growth of say, regulatory, a drag on economic growth caused by regulatory accumulation, but that's very much what happens. It's sort of like the I drink your milkshake phenomenon people talk about for oil or for even groundwater. You know, if there's not property rights established and I can continue taking action and just sucking out the water from the groundwater, then good for me and so much for everyone else who's trying to get groundwater out of there. Regulators can sort of suck some of the life out of the economy and not have to worry about it because it's not on their budgets. Now, of course, that in and of itself isn't necessarily bad either if what regulators are doing is also solving a bunch of problems. Maybe we're willing to sacrifice some of the life of the economy in order to solve issues that are otherwise intractable. But nonetheless, just to put some more numbers on things, some research that I've been involved with, I looked at the phenomenon of regulatory accumulation and whether it is affecting economic growth. And I want to differentiate something real quickly here. What I was interested in, my co-authors and I were interested in our study, it's now a couple of years old, was the effects of regulation on the growth paths of industries, of businesses, on the investments that they make to try to become bigger, more profitable, to drive, and ultimately more productive. And these are, in the long run, the drivers of economic growth. We were not so much interested in short-run compliance costs, one-time costs that you might see tallied up on a typical ledger to the degree that those exist for regulatory costs. So we focused on the effect of regulation on business investments, on business expansions, research and development, and then through that mechanism wanted to see if regulation is distorting those investments, how is that in turn distorting economic growth? And the long and the short of it is we found that average annual economic growth was nearly 1 percentage point slower than it could have been if regulation wasn't as large, regulatory accumulation hadn't been as large as it had been over the past 30 years. In a little simulation we ran, we said, what would have happened if a one-in, one-out style regulatory budget were established in 1980 and maintained all the way through 2012? And we found that the economy would have been about 25% larger under that scenario, as opposed to a scenario where regulations grew like they did on average by about 2% per year. So, in summary, there's a lot of details I threw out there. In summary, there's a lot of regulations. They've been growing consistently for many, many years, and that is not necessarily benign. There is a growth cost to that. The economy is not growing as quickly as it would have otherwise had there not been such growth of regulation. Still, maybe we're okay with that, right? Maybe the growth consequence of regulation is something we're willing to bear in exchange for achieving whatever regulation is achieving. And this is, I think, where there's the rubber meets the road, so to speak. There's a real problem here because we don't really know how well regulations, by and large, on the whole, are working. Some individual regulations, it's clear that they're having effects, but we don't have any sort of retrospective review, retrospective analysis process built into the regulatory process right now. It happens on occasion here and there, but it's not comprehensive by any means. So if you if you think that all regulations that we've put into the 180,000 pages of the Code of Federal Regulations were well designed to begin with, are achieving their goals and still need to be maintained because they're still working, then maybe all those consequences I just discussed are okay. But a couple of simple facts and a small leap of logic leads me to think that there probably are some issues in there. One, regulations are written by humans. Two, humans make mistakes. Ergo, regulations contain mistakes. So there is probably some errors lurking in the CFR that could be corrected. Chris mentioned some low-hanging fruit from recent regulations, but of course there's also, I think, another version of low-hanging fruit that we'll be able to address in the near future should this sort of approach be maintained, which is some of the really old regulations that are just designed for a different era and often created with design standards in mind of a different era, engineering standards of a different era. A lot of this is in sort of transportation-related regulations where regulators told manufacturers specifically how to build airplanes or how to build car batteries, and turning into a more flexible system is, I think, some of the low-hanging fruit that can be addressed soon too, although Chris makes good points about how do you handle those on a regulatory budget when you are turning old design standards into more dynamic performance standards. But I digress slightly. I want to go back to what I think is the most important point of what I'm going to say, at least, which is, again, the regulatory process doesn't contain a good error correction mechanism, and a regulatory budgeting scheme is a way of creating and inserting an error correction mechanism into the regulatory process. There's other ways of doing it, but I think that this is a great feature of regulatory budgeting, that the responsibility for finding and correcting errors gets laid on the regulators themselves, those career bureaucrats that Chris mentioned, those people who know where the skeletons are lurking in their closets, that know the details of some of these old regulations and whether or not they're truly working. So the fact that this approach, as opposed to something reactive like RAINS or some other sort of approach where there's maybe independent analysis of the effectiveness of regulations, the merit of this approach is that it puts that onus specifically on, it's really owned by, it's incorporated into the incentives of regulators themselves. Now, where could errors come from? A few other things that, that have been mentioned, that Jeff mentioned a few reasons that the current administration would accept a new regulation to be made is if there's a legitimate problem that needs to be solved. The converse of that is if regulations aren't solving any problem, then the regulation is created in error, or regulations could be created that were attempting to solve a legitimate problem but don't. That's an error. There's going to be consequences to that, although no benefits. Regulations that lock in specific technologies could be errors, or regulations that fail to adapt or even self-destruct to the degree that we could have something like that when a better solution is presented or the problem is solved. I'd maintain that those are erroneous as well. Regulatory budgeting would create a set of incentives for regulators to seek out those errors and correct them. So my final point might be a bit longer because it gets into some quantifications, and much of my career has been about quantifying regulation, finding ways that we can measure regulatory accumulation or different aspects of it. In fact, those numbers I said earlier, those come from our website, quantgov.org. If you go there, you can find all sorts of data about regulations or other policy. QuantGov is short for quantified governance. So quantgov.org. At quantgov.org, you'll find RegData, which is a database we've been building for years, which is a simple way of quantifying how much regulation there is. And that leads me to this, a brief discussion that I wanted to get into here, and maybe this can turn into a discussion once we have Q&A, which is any sort of regulatory budget that Congress may be considering, of course, has to have some sort of defined metrics. And Chris mentioned a couple of options that are, when combined, are perhaps attractive, measuring the number of rules, but also putting a dollar sign on those rules, monetizing them so that you get sort of the best of both worlds. And that's also what Jeff mentioned being some of the driving factors in the current executive order's regulatory budget. If you wanted to take a swing at counting up the number of rules that are on the books as opposed to the number of rules that are being created, it's a little bit harder. And that's why we did create reg data. It's a way of counting up the shalls and, prohibitions and obligations, as I mentioned earlier. But it's also not necessarily the only way to do this. Canada, by the way, has inventoried their regulations and counted up within their regulations the number of regulations that create administrative burden. Administrative burden meaning there's some sort of paperwork cost related to it or data storage related to it. So it's not just me that's doing this kind of thing. And you can go on the Canadian Treasury Board's website and see their inventories. It's very interesting. But you could, of course, monetize those administrative burdens. This has become common across those jurisdictions that are engaging in some form of regulatory budgeting. Going a step further, there's other metrics that could be used. You could look at direct compliance costs, or you could do what we've been doing in the US for many years and try to look at overall social costs, the opportunity cost of regulations. But going from the first to the last that I mentioned, we're going from simpler to more complex. And as you get more and more complex, you get into scenarios where you have potentially battling estimates. They could be coming out of lobbyists, could be coming out of trade associations, but they also are coming out of the administration. Maybe OIRA is battling one of the agency's estimates. And how those estimates are come up with are created. I've been in the belly of the beast, so to speak, worked at the Department of Transportation for 3 years doing these estimates, and it does look like science if you do it well, but there's a lot of room for manipulation, to be frank. And I don't think that's a surprise for anyone here. So as you get to more and more complex metrics, you induce more and more opportunities for gamesmanship, for manipulation of the numbers. So in that sense, I think that whatever metric is considered for regulatory budgeting going forward, maybe a combination of something simpler and complex makes sense, but simplicity is a virtue because it does at least make some consistent currency that can be on the books over time. So in closing, I'm going to leave room for Q&A. I just want to echo something that Chris also said in closing. It's the success of any sort of regulatory budget is about changing the culture of regulatory agencies and the people that work there. And it's going to really depend on buy-in by the rank and file lawyers and economists in these agencies, not just the people at the tops. British Columbia in Canada has been doing some form of regulatory budgeting for over 15 years now. And out of their reviews of their program, which has reduced regulations by over a third in BC, they've said that the people that are working in the agencies have changed their mindsets. Going into this, they viewed themselves as rule makers. One of my students put it very nicely, regulators regulate. It's their jobs. That's a good way of putting it. But in British Columbia, instead of regulators viewing themselves as rule makers, they changed into viewing themselves as rule managers, where their job is to optimize over a portfolio of rules and look at those trade-offs. They're still trying to achieve the mission of the agency, whatever it may be, but they're doing it with a different set of constraints, and there actually are constraints. So I think that that's the long-run determinant of whether any sort of regulatory budgeting scheme will be a success, the buy-in from the regulators themselves. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'll just ask one quick question before opening up to the floor. Chris, you said there was a line, you had a line that was sort of tantalizing to a lawyer. You said one of the virtues of the 2-for-1 rule, the 2-for-1 standard, is that by defining it in terms of rule, it was an unambiguous standard. And as a lawyer, I say, well, nothing's unambiguous. Let's find some ambiguity. I mean, I have to admit, I don't know off the top of my head what the definition of rule is for Executive Order 13771. Jeff, how does that work with the sort of the 2-in, 1-out rule?
Well, as you can imagine, yes, there is ambiguity in the definition of rule, but basically what we've given them credit for, we want an expansive view such that it incentivizes the agencies to clean up everything so they can, if they pull guidance documents, if they pull information requests, if they pull portions of the CFR, we will give them outs for that. Mm-hmm. And now, to be sure, in the reg budget, we don't give them monetary costs unless they quantify what they think the estimated cost of that would be. But just in terms of, giving them credit where credit's due, we want them thinking broadly and expansively. So we do take that beyond just repealing something in the CFR done through notice and comment.
All right, well, if there are any questions in the audience, there's the same two microphones. We'll start in the back with Sophie, and then you, ma'am, and then you, sir.
Thanks, this has been a great panel. I have a question for Jeff, and it has to do also with the definitions that Adam was talking about. So kudos where they're due to OMB for issuing guidance to clarify the executive order 13771, very helpful. And of course, you have to have a definition for costs, and the one that they used, which you referred to, is not those one-time costs that are sunk, but it's the ongoing costs. What I'm interested in, though, is some of those costs that we think of as sunk that are actually keeping new entrants from marketplaces. Because there are ongoing costs from that, despite the fact that we do view those as sunk costs, where we could have increased competition that could be theoretically lowering prices and improving consumer experiences. Has OIRA considered looking at those costs and reducing those barriers to entry as perhaps cost offsets, or has that even come up?
No, it does come up, and I think we, at the end of the day, the goal of the EOs is to get the agencies to a point where they can't think about regulating without deregulating, and so the process is sort of not the goal. The goal is good policy at the end of the day. And so I think we're trying to develop with respect to what I think we would call what you're referring to as authorizing regulation. So if an agency authorizes something, maybe this goes to sort of the car battery scenario of if they authorize something you couldn't do before, but then of necessity have to sort of regulate that, I think we would try to, and I don't have the ledger of how we would give them credit for, but we don't want our rules to be something that would stand in the way of that. And I think when you look at drones or you look at new technologies, I think there are a lot of new technologies where that would be exactly it. And so if we let you do something that you currently can't do, but have to put a few rules on it, I think we are working on the process of developing this category of authorizing regulations, which I think everyone would agree that that's something we want the agencies to be doing, even if it results in new quote-unquote regulations too.
Why don't we take the last two questions back to back and then give the panelists a chance to answer them together, if that's okay. We'll start with you, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Maeve Carey from the Congressional Research Service. I have a question, I think probably for Jeff, but I'm interested in the thoughts from the panel. I've been reading in media reports lately that the long-standing IRS exemption from OIRA review is under reconsideration. And so thinking about tax-related rules, tax cut rules mostly, or maybe not rules, but other actions that IRS is likely to take, I was just wondering if you could talk about how that fits into the regulatory budget framework. Presumably, tax-related actions will come with compliance costs, at least in the form of paperwork burden. Are those costs in the way that the executive order views costs, on the cost-benefit ledger, how does that fit together, basically? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll decline to comment on any deliberative issues, but we'll draw an analogy to the Medicare payment rules, which I think are a good place to look. So when even a sniffle in the Medicare payment rules can move billions of dollars around. And I think those would generally be viewed as transfers, but in terms of the compliance costs and if anything leads to a deadweight loss or affects private conduct in a way that deters people from doing something or encourages them to do something. So if a Medicare rule just results in money shifting hands, that's not the sort of thing we'd look for, but we would look at, as you said, the compliance burdens, the transfers, any deadweight losses. And so that's the type of analysis with respect to these transfer rules that we would usually look for.
And we have a hard stop at 1:30, so this will be our last question.
Okay, quick question. This relates to perhaps both Mr. McLaughlin and Mr. Harris. There's a phrase that's been coined that I've heard a few times. It might have been one of the panelists that coined it, regulatory dark matter. that I think relates to, in particular, relates to guidance. Guidance is a form of regulatory dark matter, or can be. Back in January of 2007, OMB issued a bulletin called, I think it was the bulletin in connection with agency good guidance practices. Is there any thought about sort of tuning up that bulletin and perhaps giving it some more teeth so that it would be a little bit more sort of honored rather than honored in the breach?
Sure. Well, I think that's a good question as well. I know, Administrator Rao has said many times that that's one of her priorities. So certainly on a daily basis, we engage with the agencies in a way to achieve best practices, and I think are definitely looking at a number of different options, whether in terms of compliance or in terms of updating the standards. And, the Hill has had a lot of really good interest in this recently. And so I think building off a lot of those efforts, I'm hoping that she'll be rolling out something soon to really sort of formalize some of the work we've been doing on that.
Okay. Well, before we close, I do want to say thank you to all of you who've joined us today. I know you're all busy people, and so thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend these conversations. And of course, thank you so much to our speakers for offering all these insights.
And thank you to Adam White
thank
for
you.
organizing the whole thing.
Thank you.